Welcome to Vintage Video. I'm David Mossner. In this edition, we're taking a look at South Dakota history. While I didn't grow up there, our timing was good in that we moved to the state 2 years before its 100th birthday. If you watch earlier episodes of Vintage Video, you'll see some of the early stories I did on the state's celebration, including one on an old-fashioned cattle drive, a recreation of a Pony Express, and a canoe carrying pelts down the Missouri River to St. Louis, just like trappers did in the 19th century. This episode features 6 stories on its history, starting with a creative take that brought some of those historic tales to life.
South Dakota, South Dakota, land of infinite variety.
Sky as far as the eye can see. South Dakota, you're home to me.
The song and dance is part history lesson and storytelling from the pages of South Dakota's past. One of the play's writers, Don Boyd, says it's not too early to start the party for South Dakota's 100th birthday.
I think if people in South Dakota really think about it, we're almost 100 years old. I can't even envision what the excitement must have been like in 1887. Because they were starting the wheels turning to be accepted as a state. And I'm sure there were a lot of people working very hard back then to make statehood happen. And I think there's a tremendous number of people in South Dakota right now working very hard to make sure the centennial is an event that we'll remember for all of our lives. We paid a fee to the South Dakota Centennial Commission for the right to use the logo to present ourselves as the official South Dakota Centennial Play. And then each performance that we do in the communities, we turn around and refund a portion of our fee back to the Centennial Commission, which they use for funding for some of the statewide projects.
I've got a better idea. Why don't you get a train and take it to the people? Let them decide. We'll call it the Capital on Wheels.
Well, sir, there have been numerous
Make it available to communities throughout the state. We have done it in Alcester, South Dakota. We performed it 4th of July weekend down in Tyndall, and they used it as fundraisers. And it's a way for the local, whoever the local centennial coordinator is, or the committee in that community, to kind of kick off their participation in the centennial.
Opening South Dakota's history books turned into a lesson for the actors in the play.
I was a failing student in history in high school. I didn't think it was ever very interesting, and I guess that's why it's kind of funny that I would even agree to do that. But it was interesting because once I got into the play and I had a purpose for reading the history, it all became very unique.
Kathy Valnes says portraying Sakakawea is one of her favorite roles in the show, and says getting extra actors out of the audience is just part of the fun.
We just have fun with them. They go where we tell them to go on the stage, and they do the things that we tell them to, and it's really kind of fun to see people who aren't really into theater really do have kind of an interest in that. Since you left the Ohio Valley, Dakota bound we are, Dakota bound we are, and
Benjamin wrote the songs in the centennial play.
South Dakota, short as its history may be, has had its colorful moments, including political corruption, embezzlement, of course the war years, and also different things come up, and it's nice to know that we have all those things in our heritage. It's not all that pressing, it's a lot of fun. No, we wanted to get a good start on things, certainly, and we wanted to allow people to have as much opportunity as possible to see the show.
To keep it shady, not only did we have cows and grain in the bin, we had 7 young'uns under age of 10. Great cold sun beaming down on the flowers, giant cottonwood trickles down to rain showers. Whippoorwill wakes me in the morning, an old owl's hoot signals in the evening. Not only do we have the memories to save, we got grandchildren dancing on the grave. The family was strong.
We do a piece on W.W. Taylor, who was he retired during Governor Sheldon's administration, and he left with virtually all of the money that South Dakota had that had been in the bank. He left with $367,000, embezzled it.
$167,000!
Well, get me here immediately!
I'm afraid that would be impossible, sir.
Why?
He's in South America. I think it was a planned vacation.
Then he came back and was put in prison for 2 years, but South Dakota had to float special bond issues so that they didn't go default, they didn't become bankrupt.
The official South Dakota's centennial play is planning to run through 1989 wherever they're booked to give what the actors say is their version of the way it was and is in South Dakota. Dave Mossner reporting, 430.
A lot of South Dakota's history was covered in the pages of the Capital Journal, a family-owned newspaper with a history of its own.
The capital city's first newspaper, The Signal, started printing in 1881. It later consolidated with other papers to become the Daily Capital Journal in 1889. 16 years later, the paper became the property of the Hippels.
In 1905, my father, John Hippel, bought the Daily Capital Journal, and he was the publisher until his death in 1939.
R.B. Hippel has been publishing the Capital Journal ever since. You could say Printers' Ink runs in the Hippel family. R.B.'s father, John Hippel, started his own paper after moving to Dakota Territory in 1883.
At the age of 18, he started a newspaper at a town called Dakota City in Hutchinson County. And later moved it to Parkston when the railroad was built through the county, and called it the Parkston Advance. He was subsequently elected as the second state auditor and came to Pierre.
John Hippel served as state auditor from 1893 to 1897. R.B. didn't get into the newspaper business until reaching the ripe old age of 6.
My father was publishing a newspaper when I was born, and I sold my first newspapers as a child. In April of 1906, when I was 6 years old, on the occasion of the San Francisco earthquake.
The earth might shake again if the Capital Journal doesn't stay in the family. George Hippel is the third generation with newspaper ink on his hands.
This is the only thing we've ever done. We grew up when we were kids, we played at our old shop, and then as we grew up, we gradually got asked to do various things in there, and we just sort of, except for a stint in the Army, we came back and went right into the business.
The business is part of life at an early age for Hipple children. Terry Hipple is part of the 4th generation following in the family footsteps.
It's hard to think about working elsewhere. I guess we've all had job offers at either other papers or other businesses, and some of them at quite a bit more money, but it's pretty hard to walk away from something that's been in the family for, 108 years.
While the paper tries to stay on top of the news, the publishing family itself has a close link to one of South Dakota's most important projects, the dams on the Missouri River. R.B. Hipple introduced Pick to Sloan, the authors of the Pick-Sloan Plan.
When the two men came to Pierre to meet with Governor Sharp and Congressman Francis Case, Governor Sharp was unable to keep the appointment and asked me to take his place. And I met Colonel Pick, and when Glenn Sloan showed up, I introduced the two men. And when Francis Case showed up, the four of us had lunch together, and that was the start of the relationship between Colonel Pick, who later became General Pick, and Glenn Sloan. And that was the genesis of the Pick-Sloan program for flood control on the upper Missouri River.
Mr. Hipple says early plans included navigation as far north as Pierre on the river for barges and large irrigation projects that have never been completed. He still types out the paper's daily editorial every morning, expressing the paper's viewpoint. Day-to-day editing is left in the hands of Tony Mangan.
With this paper, the big thing is its history. Our publisher has lived more history than we'll ever see. And that's the big thing, and that's what we like to try to use, is his history. He knows so much about this state, and especially this area. You've got to go through, various family channels at times, and we've had some family meetings to discuss things we want to do with the news. But it's something you got to live with, and it's part of being in a family business, and it can be difficult. But I've got to say that for the most part, they've let me do what I want to do with the newspaper.
That newspaper ranks as the state's oldest family-owned paper. It will stay that way for a while. The Hipples aren't selling.
For the past 25 years, many people have solicited me to sell this newspaper, but I received it from my father. My sons received it from me, and their sons now are employed in producing and managing the newspaper.
R.B.'s grandson Terry has 3 children of his own, representing the 5th generation of Hipples.
I don't know about ink in their veins. They've definitely had ink on their hands, but we'll have to see what that holds down the line. When I really felt an opportunity opened up here, I took it, and I've been delighted. I don't know what else to say. It's been a lot of personal pride, and it's something I hope that my kids do take a look at continuing.
With the 5th generation of Hipples coming along, it's likely Piers and the Hipples Capital Journal will keep rolling off the presses for some time to come. I'm Dave Mossner reporting for 30.
Europeans began exploring the Dakota Territory in the 18th century, but the first evidence of the French explorers left behind was in 1743. It was discovered by school children in 1913.
On this hilltop overlooking the Missouri River on March 30th, 1743, the Verdansk buried a lead plate claiming the region for France. The plate now rests across the river on another hill in the Cultural Heritage Center.
The three of us were together, and Hattie happened to notice something sticking out of the ground that was quite different than what we had been looking at before, and she kind of kicked it with her toe and it didn't budge, and so that encouraged us to dig it up, see what it was.
It was the Verdansk Plate, considered South Dakota's most important find, discovered by 12-year-old Ethel Parrish and friends George O'Reilly and Harriet Foster, February 16, 1913.
If we had studied our history and had listened to our teacher, we should have known what it was. But you see, what you do, you don't. You're young kids, you don't care if you study it or not.
Ethel moved away and missed out on some of the fame associated with finding the plate. She was later recognized and is the only surviving member of the three left who found the plate. She says she knows now how important that plate is, and reunited with it 76 years later, she says it's much heavier now than the first time she held the Verdansk Plate. Dave Mossner, KELOLAND News, Pierre.
That plate was found on a hill outside Fort Pierre, which sits on the west side of the Missouri River. As part of the state's milestone, that plate and a century's worth of history was packed up and moved out of the State Museum.
More than 1,000 boxes, 500 feet of bubble wrap, and a mile of tape are packing the State Museum's 17,000 items, including the state's crown jewel, the Verdansk Plate.
It represents the most important find in the northern Great Plains. This link between the French and the Arikara Indians, the settlement of the region. That is probably our most well-known item.
Not everything is so easy to wrap. An 80-pound cash register, an upright grand piano, and a loom don't go in boxes.
Certain things that will defy boxing. A printing press, for example. We have a Moline Mant farm wagon circa 1910. That's some of the things that are going to have to be basically trailered over there.
Not everything will be unpacked at once in the new home. They may have to wait a while before going on display. While the packing and moving continues, the Archives Research will open in the Cultural Heritage Center March 6th. The first exhibition will be here May 4th. Dave Mossner, KELOLAND News, Pierre.
When we moved to Pierre in 1986, I was intrigued by an old building which seemed to be on its last legs. A developer purchased the old St. Charles Hotel and brought it back to life in time to join the centennial celebration.
Charles Hyde built the hotel in 1911, just a few blocks from the Capitol, which was still under construction at the time. The hotel was the place for legislators and others to spend the night in Pierre. The hotel's first bellhop, Ed Duffy, recalls an early day on the job.
One time they had a big crowd and they got me to bus. I never did. And I seen those girls carrying those trays, picking them up like that and walking off with them. And they had stands in there, and they got a tray loaded, and I see all that, and I thought I'd try it. And I got that, and it went right down a man's back, gravy and all. Right down in. And out that back door I went. It wasn't like it is now. It had the old annex on there. And out that back door I went to, and jumped off. I didn't wait at the steps, I jumped off it. And I kept right on running until I got the boat landing.
The granddaughter of the man who built the St. Charles Hotel, Marge Gallimore, recalls some of the early days.
I can remember a lot of the different functions that my father, who managed the hotel for a while, would tell me about the people that had come in. I particularly remember his telling me how secretive Lindbergh's visit had been here, that in fact it wasn't until several days after Lindbergh had gone that he did tell the rest of the family that Lindbergh had been here and he had visited with him and shaken his hand, a moment of great pride to my father.
The hotel's location near the Capitol made it a political hotspot. Stan Ruttman was a bellhop in the 1940s. He recalls even then the lobbyists played a big part of a legislator's life.
most of your legislators stayed here, and your lobbyists. And we always used to kind of get a kick out of the lobbyists, and the legislators come in, and then they didn't give the legislators a lot of money. They come in, and some of these legislators were paid very little money when you think about what they did. So anyway, they used to come in, and they'd come into the cafe, and Al Falk was running the cafe then. And they'd come in and they'd say, "Oh, give me just a cup of coffee." And they'd sit there until they seen the lobbyists come along, and then bingo, there was a chance for a good free breakfast, and they'd jump right over there and get a breakfast on it, see.
Peer publisher Robert Hipple learned to play pool in the hotel's billiards room, learned to dance in the hotel's ballroom. Hipple remembers a visit in 1912 by President Taft and the position the hotel has had with state politics. But in the 50s, Hipple recalls, the Hotel St. Charles started downhill.
A pattern of legislators renting private homes for the legislative session. As I think about it, probably that's when the hotel began to lose its political significance.
We were always very conscious of the fact that it was a prideful thing to have this size hotel in Pierre, but it became economically hard for people to come in and do as many things about repairing, modernizing, to compete with the other motels and hotels that came in, that it did fall into disrepair, and the tenants had other choices of apartments to move to, so they were able to move out into more convenient and modern locations. And that was one of the reasons why a lot of the apartment people left, I feel. And the businesses could find other locations downtown that were as reasonably priced as they were here. So I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that other places became available to them.
Gallimore says she hopes now the newly refinished Hotel St. Charles can keep its refound grandeur for some time to come. Dave Mossner reporting, 430.
As the political reporter for Kello, I was assigned to look at the state's governors during the first 100 years. You'll notice a flaming fountain in the video. That fountain is fed by a natural artesian well which brings natural gas and water to the surface.
6 governors already finished their terms as governor by the time the Capitol building was completed in 1910. While not every governor worked in an office under the dome, each did have similar problems finding money to finance state government and...
Beginning with Millett through to Governor George S. Mickelson, we've had this constant battle with nature. Adversity in terms of agriculture periodically.
Dr. Linwood Oyas of Augustana College put together a book on all the governors, starting with William Jayne and the other 9 men that served as territorial executives. Governor George Mickelson says many of the challenges that faced the state years ago are still around, but the government is different.
Government has grown, and people's demands on government have grown much in the last 40 years, much more than they were then. People didn't tend to look to state government or the federal government to solve a lot of the problems that they had. It's with this generation, I guess, that I grew up in, and there was just more of a dependence on government.
Former Governor Frank Farrar served from 1969 to 71. He says there have been a lot of changes in the job of governor over the last 20 years.
Being a governor 20 years ago was easier than today because there was less government then, less agencies, less people, and many less problems, and less costly. Government, I think, was more efficient because of size. As you get bigger, you lose efficiencies. And so I think the governors of today have a bigger problem than when I was in, and my problems were greater than people who were 20 or 40 years prior to me.
No woman has ever been elected governor, although 4 have tried for the office. Alice Lorraine Dale ran in 1922, Gladys Pyle in 1930, Jenny O'Hearn ran in 1946. In the last gubernatorial election in 1986, longtime state auditor and Secretary of State Alice Kundert ran in the Republican primary. She lost, but expects to see a woman governor in the next 30 years.
I see a lot of women out there, and these women may still show. I look at Debbie Anderson, I look at Mary McClure. These are remarkable women, and there are other remarkable women that are out there that are now not even in politics. So when the timing is right and the issues are right, it's going to happen in less than 100 years, believe me.
Dr. Oya says Nils Boe, who ran the state from 1965 to 69, and Bill Janklow, who served from 79 to 1987, are 2 top leaders in the state's history. But the governor who stands out for Oyas is Peter Norbeck, governor from 1917 to 1921.
In a sense, there was a kind of a transition with Norbeck. With him, the executive branch in the state became more activist, initiating a number of measures, as we've indicated, some of them rather radical measures. Up until that time, it had been primarily implementation on the part of governors. And of course, with him, there was a tremendous rash of legislation which was introduced. And he was a leader.
One legacy of the Norbeck years is the state cement plant. He also tried to start a state elevator and coal mine, and he's remembered for creating Custer State Park. The state's had 1 populist governor, 5 Democrats, and 22 Republican governors since 1889. Former Governor Farrar says because of the past, he's optimistic for the next century.
I think we've not only laid a great foundation for the next 100 years in South Dakota, but I think if the nation would emulate what we do here and how we operate our government and how we're interested in our people and how we believe in opportunity and the free enterprise system, I think we've laid a foundation for the entire country.
I'm Dave Mossner reporting for 30.
That's it for this edition of Vintage Video, South Dakota History. I'm David Mossner. See you next time.